All right, welcome back. As we indicated, the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology has started this hearing. We were telling you about the gentleman you see speaking right now is a man named Michael Doyle. He's a congressman from Pennsylvania. He is the chair of this meeting. We'll listen in as they present some of the evidence here. We do expect to hear from a number of witnesses as well, including Soledad O'Brien, a former journalist, or current journalist, I should say, who's worked for CNN and Al Jazeera and others. We'll also hear from Georgetown University law professor Jonathan Turley. So let's listen in. They're kind of setting the ground rules. Here's the opening statement from Congressman Michael Doyle.
And prevented so much anguish and grief. In the midst of this pandemic, we also saw the rise of the Stop the Steal movement, fomented by former President Trump and propagated by members of the media that sought to dispute the outcome of our elections and overturn our democratic process. As we all know, this led directly to the horrific events of January 6th, the attack on our Capitol and our democracy by insurrectionists motivated by former President Trump. 5 lives were lost that day, and more have been lost since. A Capitol police officer was murdered. Others were savagely attacked, beaten, and called vile racial epithets. All of our lives were put at risk, as was the vice president's. The First Amendment protects the freedom of the press. All right,
so we're just going to kind of provide some perspective here. Obviously, we're just talking about this with Bernie Kerik and the Brian Sitnick story. They're continuing these same narratives that we heard during the impeachment. But we're going to let him speak, talking about murder and insurrection and things like that. Those are technical terms, not proven, but that is what they want to talk about. So again, here is Congressman Michael Doyle with his opening statements, but just wanted to provide some context there for you all. So here we go.
These more recent events reflect a frightening escalation. As Ms. O'Brien points out in her testimony, media companies have increasingly set aside journalistic standards to chase audience share and higher profits. Ms. Bell's testimony discusses the decline of local media and local newspapers, once the lifeblood of our democracy, and now rapidly accelerated by the financial hardships of COVID. These changes have given rise to national media entities that are more focused on the kind of tactics we see from social media companies. They engage their viewers by enraging them and further dividing us and our nation. We have also seen the rise of news as entertainment, where the claims of anchors and commentators are likened to performance art. When they are challenged in court, the lawyers from their own networks even claim that no reasonable person could believe these people are speaking the truth or reporting facts. When truth becomes a commodity to be traded upon for profit, and facts and consequences don't matter to those who report them, our democracy is undermined. It is the responsibility of this subcommittee to hold these institutions to a higher standard. Thank you, and I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and I yield the remainder of my time to my friend and colleague, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing today. Let me put it bluntly. Misinformation is killing Americans and damaging our democracy. We have to examine how conspiracies and lies convince people to dismiss public health measures and refuse life-saving vaccines. This is not about left versus right. This is about life and death. Similarly, the January 6th insurrection was built on a foundation of lies about mail-in ballots, voting machines, and election results. The First Amendment prohibits Congress from enacting laws abridging the freedom of speech, and I'm an ardent supporter of it. It does not, however, stop us from examining the public health and democratic implications of misinformation. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing today, and I yield back. I also thank you who are with us today.
That is Congresswoman Eshoo from Silicon Valley right there. She is the one of the members of this committee who wrote the letter taking on directly Newsmax and Fox News and OAN, and you heard her. She was given the additional time there from the chairman of the committee, or at least the chairman of this particular meeting, Michael Doyle of Pennsylvania. So let's continue to follow this now. Again, we're going to provide some context here. You can hear some of the same talking points that you hear on left-wing media and from Democrats coming through in this hearing. So let's listen in.
Witnesses who are appearing before us today on this hearing focused on disinformation and extremism in the media. Well, disinformation, misinformation, and extremism in the media are all serious issues that this subcommittee should be examining in a bipartisan way. Unfortunately, today's hearing is not about that. Earlier this week, several of my colleagues sent a disturbing letter to private companies asking them questions that imply that these companies should stop carrying certain news content. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to enter that letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
I think, my friend, as the title of the hearing indicates, the majority's intent behind today's hearing is to fan the flames of silencing certain viewpoints in America by trying to suppress and censor speech, a concept that has the potential to destroy our democracy. This is deeply troubling. It should be deeply troubling to everyone here today. With this goal at hand, we are embarking upon a dangerous path of using this committee to attack the foundation of fact and further diminish trust in journalism. The antidote to bad speech is more speech. Rather than suppressing speech and viewpoints that we don't agree with, we should be encouraging more speech and conversations between one another. Sadly, it appears we're doubling down on encouraging the cancel culture of the left instead of identifying bipartisan solutions to encourage and support factual, local, national news. We are all facing unprecedented challenges in this country, which includes work to combat a once-in-a-century pandemic. There's never been a more important time for journalism to be more accurate and reliable. Having reliable news sources that report factual content that can even be a matter of life and death. The damage done to our democracy by further dividing our nation and ignoring the patently false and inaccurate information coming from the media outlets cannot be understated. Before I close, I'd like to bring to light just one of the most recent examples we have seen in the press concerning the attacks on the Capitol grounds on January the 6th. Republicans and Democrats, including myself, have condemned the events of January the 6th. It is disturbing to say the least. To insinuate responsibility for the mob violence that took place that day lies only with the media and not with the individuals who carried out these actions and committed crimes. That is flat out wrong. And at this time, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to our whip, Mr. Scalise from Louisiana.
Well, thank my friend from Ohio for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing and our witnesses as well. And clearly, we've all been very vocal in denouncing the events that happened on January 6th. Is a clear example of not only mob violence, but also how political discourse can get out of control. But for anybody to just try to suggest that discourse started getting out of control on January 6th would be disingenuous when you look at where we've gotten and how far this has come. I want to take you back to June 14th, 2017, a day that a gunman walked onto a baseball field and shot at over a dozen members of Congress, including myself. There's been a lot of investigation into it. The FBI did a report. The gunman was motivated by hypercharged rhetoric that he was hearing from the left, from high prominent elected officials, as well as media personalities. In fact, Mr. Chairman, there is a report that the FBI did where they included some of the writings of the gunman, where he talks specifically about the people who motivated him and inspired him to commit this shooting, which would have been very deadly if he was successful without the bravery and heroism of Capitol Police. I would like to ask unanimous consent that this be entered into the record, which is the FBI, some of the FBI excerpts from his writings. I enter that not to say that I blame those people that he mentions for his motivation. I say this to let you know that I don't blame those other people. I blame the shooter. The shooter's the one who should be held accountable, and I'm very clear about that. But it's an example that we all need to be aware of our rhetoric and can all be doing a better job of toning down the rhetoric. But we also need to call it out where we see it, not just on the other side of the aisle, but on both sides. Just as I called out January 6th activities, I called out the violence I saw over the summer when through hypercharged rhetoric, people were burning down cities, were killing cops, killing other people. Let's be consistent in calling it out, not trying to suggest disingenuously that it only comes from one side of the political spectrum. Let's be fair and recognize We can all do a better job of encouraging the rhetoric to be toned down, and we all need to call out political violence wherever we see it, because it's not acceptable in America from the left or the right. With that, I yield back.
All right, so Congressman Steve Scalise there obviously knows what this means. He and Congressman Bob Latta from Ohio, they are the Republican response to the opening statement there from the Democrats. Congressman Latta quoting former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis in the Whitney v. California Supreme Court case on freedom of speech, where he said the cure for bad speech is more speech. And obviously Scalise, who was a victim, as he indicated there, of that shooting himself from a politically motivated gunman on June 14, 2017, talking about the fault lies with the shooter in his case. As in the Capitol riot, it belongs with those who broke the law. So we'll continue to listen in now. This is Congressman Pallone, who is from New Jersey, I believe. He is the actual chairman of this committee. So we'll continue to listen in here.
Controversial or even partisan. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore the spread of misinformation that causes public harm. Putting a spotlight on the issue and having an open dialogue is exactly what the founding fathers envisioned, because it may help us solve a very dangerous problem. And we owe it to our constituents and to our democracy to examine how and why disinformation is being aired on traditional media and social media. And that means we must ask uncomfortable questions, like whether these media outlets, for example, have an incentive to air extreme conspiratorial programming or content, and how journalists can help each other find ways to cover controversial topics in a way that doesn't undermine our democratic structure and health. And there are no easy answers, but we have to obviously try to find them. In my opinion, there are too many traditional media outlets that have yet to seriously wrestle with these questions. Very few have acknowledged their role in spreading deadly misinformation.
We're going to continue to listen in on this. This is Congressman Pallone from New Jersey. He's the chairman of this committee. He's giving his statement now. This is the opening statement portion here. We just heard from Congressman Steve Scalise and Robert Latta, Republicans on this committee. Let's welcome in now T.W. Shannon, the former Oklahoma Speaker of the House, also Republican strategist and attorney Amanda Maki, and with us as well, presidential political strategist and New York Times bestselling author Dick Morris. Dick, first to you. You know, we expected this hearing to be very partisan. We expected the language to be bombastic coming from Democrats. But again, it seems to mirror so closely what we've heard for the last, I don't know, month and a half, ever since this happened on January 6th. And they are using the riot at the Capitol to encroach on the First Amendment and our free speech.
Yeah, I think there's one very important point here that's not been made. The danger here is not regulation that could happen or statutory actions that could happen. The danger is this hearing, because the very fact of having this hearing intimidates the platforms that are providing Newsmax and Fox News, and the networks themselves, and the anchors, and the guests, and everybody who works there. It's designed to intimidate them, to have them self-censor, and understand that if they step out of line, they could get their whole network decertified, deprogrammed, and be taken off the air. This is the very tactic Putin uses in Russia. He doesn't send you to Siberia anymore. He threatens you, intimidates you, and has you sort of self-censor. And that's the goal of this hearing. And Newsmax and Fox News both need to fight against that, stand up for it, and be counted.
And Amanda, as we heard Michelle Malkin indicate at the top of the hour here, this is, a continuation of what we saw under the Obama administration. And I'm going to say this a lot. I've said it a lot in the past. James Risen, the former New York Times reporter, called President Obama the greatest threat to a free press in a generation. And now it's not just him. It runs right through the Democratic Party, right into this subcommittee hearing.
That's right. Matt Taibbi, certainly a liberal journalist, wrote about that today. And I think it's good when you see both the left and the right attacking the Democrats for what they're doing. They've really taken this too far. As the Congresswoman said, Anna Eshoo, she said this is about misinformation. This is about censorship. This is about an infringement on our First Amendment rights. And I think what the Democrats are doing really is they're building on their successes from before the election. What happened with the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's overseas dealings? It was squashed. They didn't allow for it to be placed on social media platforms. Look at what Apple and Amazon did. They took down an entire social media site that was conservative, a conservative alternative to Twitter and Parler. So they're building on those successes. they're basically veiled threats against these companies and what they're doing with conservative voices. And it is very good to hear that both the left and the right are equally attacking Democrats for what they're doing.
Well,
and there will be repercussions in 2022 for this.
I don't know about equally attacking what's going on here, but there has been some pushback, bipartisan pushback as well. There should. You know, in TW, this is not a defense of Michael Cohen by any means, but he went to prison basically for lying to Congress here. And you have this member of Congress, Michael Doyle, talking about a Capitol Hill police officer being murdered. But just yesterday, we saw PolitiFact change their fact check of this. The New York Times has also changed their accounting of the story. Sitnik's own family has come out and did that interview with the Daily Mail yesterday saying that he was not in fact murdered, but they continue to perpetuate this false narrative about the story. I mean, who's the one spreading misinformation around here?
You know, John, never before has our first rights been so under attack. Never before have we seen this. In fact, some days I wake up and I look at, you know, images of our United States Capitol surrounded by fences and barbed wire. You know, even after the Speaker of the House has said that fences were immoral. You have to wonder, is this the United States of America anymore? When you see these Gestapo-style
every
tactics.
day, TW, and I hate to cut you off, but I want to listen into, because Kathy McMorris-Rogers, who's the ranking member, the senior Republican on this committee, she's now speaking. We'll get back to our panel in just a minute, but let's listen.
A hyper-partisan hearing to shame and blame. You wouldn't be sending letters pressuring private companies to block conservative media outlets. I'm not only disappointed in this hearing, I'm deeply troubled by it. Every journalist, from MSNBC and CNN to the New York Times, should be concerned by the majority's actions. And anyone who values free speech and a free press should be worried. Elected officials using their platform to pressure private companies to censor media outlets they disagree with? That sounds like actions from the Chinese Communist Party, not duly elected representatives of the United States Congress. Here we cherish free speech and a free independent press. We believe in dialogue and in the battle of ideas. Rather than censure and silence constitutionally protected speech, the answer is more speech. That's the American way. And surely, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Doyle, you agree with me. You have once believed that you stated that you believe threats against broadcasters for airing legally protected speech to be illegal. Less than a year ago, you sent a letter to the FCC decrying attempts to censure or interfere with broadcasters' discretion to air legally protected content. I would ask you to take a look at this letter, and I ask unanimous consent to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
That letter, it says, and I quote, "At a time when autocratic governments around the world are using the corona pandemic as an excuse to suppress press freedoms, we must reaffirm, not undermine, America's commitment to free press." So what's changed? As you once put it, quote, "To stay silent could undermine the First Amendment." So let's come together and let's make sure that we do not have a censorship campaign based upon political ideology or someone saying something you disagree with. That's not the standard we want to set. Under your new approach, a lot of media would cease to exist. Should CNN still be carried after hosting Governor Cuomo? For months, media lauded him and legitimized his lethal response to COVID-19. He even won an Emmy for his use of TV to spread misinformation. How do we know it was misinformation? Because of a balance of networks that pursued investigative journalism. Should MSNBC be carried after years of pushing the false Russia collusion narrative? Thanks to independent journalists and a robust free press, we've learned their reporting was false. Does your news standard stop with cable news, or should it be applied to social media? It's un-American when you're setting control for you to redefine for yourselves what is true. Do you think Republican members of Congress agree with all the content on media? No. Have we sent TV companies threatening letters to stop carrying certain channels? No. Now more than ever, we must uphold the First Amendment. It states Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. It's unique to Americans. It's been fought for. It's been defended. It's foundational to our personal rights and liberties. So we should all be troubled by what appears to be an attack on the First Amendment. This is an abuse of power. Ours is a country for we the people, not a few in a position of authority dictating to the rest. So today the media is the target, but where does it end? We've already seen liberal ideology pushed in our schools, where we work, the books we read, who we communicate with, how we practice our faith. It's frightening. And you know what the worst part is? People are afraid of a woke and authoritarian system that is getting them fired, canceled, and shamed. And so they're being silent. They have no voice. They can't trust the broken institutions to protect them. This culture of fear is unjust. And this committee should not be using fear to force everyone to be the same or be destroyed. It's abuse of power. And it's a force of a state religion of liberal ideology. I embrace all of us to embrace our fundamental rights that lie at the foundation of a free government by free men. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements shall be made part of the record. I would like now to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Ms. Soledad O'Brien, anchor, matter of fact, CEO of Soledad O'Brien Productions. Welcome. Mr. Jonathan Turley, professor, the George Washington University Law School. Welcome, sir. Ms. Kristen Danielle Orquiza, co-founder, marked by COVID. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Emily Bell, director of the Toast Center for Digital Media, Columbia University. We want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. And we will start with Ms. O'Brien. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the chairman, thank you to the members of the committee, and of course, those who joined me in testifying. Back in 2005, CNN aired a piece on Lou Dobbs Tonight, reporting that the U.S. had 7,000 new cases of leprosy in the previous 3 years because of unscreened illegal immigrants. That figure was completely false. Back then, the official leprosy statistics showed about 7,000 cases of leprosy over the last 30 years, not 3. But Dobbs' lie advanced his agenda of demonizing undocumented immigrants, so it stuck, and he got away with it. To those of us at CNN reporting on the communities that he degraded, it was disheartening and insulting, and it was also only the beginning. We had entered an era where broadcasters would begin repeating and re-energizing lies and liars, an era that would set the stage for xenophobic and racist narratives that would take hold and polarize this country. I've been a journalist for more than 30 years, reporting and anchoring for local TV, network news, cable, places like NBC, WBZ TV, HBO Real Sports, CNN, Hearst. I do a podcast on Quake Media, documentaries, series for my own production company. And so my point is that I have my feet very firmly planted on the media landscape. And this is what the landscape looks like to me. Media, disguised as journalism, has been spreading lies for years, elevating liars and using the ensuing slugfest to chase ratings, hits, subscriptions, advertisers, period, full stop. So how do we get here? Michael Rich, who is the CEO of the RAND Corporation, where I am honored to serve on the board, defines what happened as truth decay, the diminishing role of facts and analysis in public life, in important conversations about policy issues, policy decisions, and elections. And I believe this era of truth decay began when local newspapers were badly, even mortally wounded by the emergence of free social media and the decline of advertising dollars like classified ads. Our country has lost almost 2,100 papers since 2004. Local news is the heartbeat of American journalism, the glue of civic participation, the place where we turn to for information about our local taxes, quality education, infrastructure, and the demise left the public with only the unfiltered and unverified cauldron of presumed fact and opinion that is social media. The public turned to TV for traditional reporting, especially on politics, where 65% of Americans report trusting information from TV and radio, depending on whether the stations conform to their political leanings. But here's the problem. TV didn't fill the void of in-depth reporting on America's communities by producing stories about policies that affect regular people. Instead, it became a place where facts often go to die. TV, cable news in particular, relies on the cheap and easy booking of talking heads who exchange colorful barbs, entertaining outbursts, and sometimes peddle outright fiction. It's only gotten worse as reporters and anchors chase ratings, toss aside objectivity to divide us into false categories, I believe, of left and right, manipulating facts and debating the liars they booked for their very own shows. Today, viewers who come looking for information instead get enraging and contradictory facts from an endless churn of guests who are not in the least representative of the public. On Meet the Press, Face the Nation, and This Week back in 2015, 80% of the guests were white, 12% were women, 2% were women of color, 41% were Republican, 22% were Democrats. All of this has eroded the public trust. 72% of Americans said they trusted the media back in 1976. By 2020, that number had fallen to 40%. So why did the media march down this road? Money. News organizations need cheap way to draw big ratings, and big ratings mean more ad dollars, and it's really just that simple. And when news organizations make decisions based on ratings rather than responsible reporting, disinformation flourishes in dangerous ways. Important conversations are clouded, scrutiny is reduced, trust in our institution erodes. So what to do about all this? Let me be clear that Congress cannot and should not regulate journalism in defiance of the First Amendment. But here's what we can do. Don't book liars or advance lies. Cover the fact that lies and propaganda are being disseminated, but do not book people to lie on your show because it elevates them and presents a lie as another side. Stop posing every story as having two sides. Some stories, in fact, have many, many sides and are more complicated. And also, lies don't have a side. Take the time to unravel and report and give history and context. We, as reporters, are verifiers. Every perspective does not deserve a platform. Media thrives on the open exchange of ideas, but that doesn't mean you have to book a neo-Nazi every time you book someone who is Jewish. Balance does not mean giving voice to liars, to bigots, and to kooks. Stop saying you want a diverse staff and go hire one fast. The public will trust you again if you tell the truth about who lives in this country and report accurately on communities. Recognize that objectivity means having an open mind, not a lack of judgment. If you do not call a lie or racism, you empower the liar, you empower the racist. Support efforts to challenge media that disseminates misinformation, particularly in vulnerable communities. And most importantly, support ground level reporting, journalism, the place, in fact, where major networks and cable news gets a lot of its best stories. America trusts the media to deliver accurate, factual, unbiased information. It's the grist of democracy. It's the stuff that enables us to have intelligent and accurate conversations with our neighbors, to cast informed votes and make thoughtful and intelligent decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes Mr. Turley. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir. Jonathan, you need to unmute.
I'm sorry. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Lotta, members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to appear before you today. Appearing before the committee on a subject of disinformation in the media is not for the faint of heart. You know, this is an issue that is heavily laden with political passions and agendas. As evident in my writings, I maintain what was once a mainstream view of free speech, that the greatest protection against bad speech is more speech. That view is admittedly under fire and indeed may be a minority view today, but history has shown that public and private forms of censorship do not produce better speech. It is rather a self-replicating, self-perpetuating path that only produces more censorship and more controlled speech. That's why I've encouraged you in my testimony not to proceed down that slippery slope towards censorship. I've come to the subject as someone who's written, litigated, testified in this area for decades. I also worked for television and print media for decades, including past contracts under NBC, MSNBC, CBS, BBC, and Fox. And I've had a wonderful past relationship with Soledad. Now, extremist and violent speech is not an abstract or academic matter with me or many others who work in the public domain. Through the years, I've received hundreds of threats against myself, my family, even my dog. My home has been targeted. Multiple campaigns have sought my termination as a professor in the Clinton and Trump impeachment hearings. Thus, while I generally am viewed as a free speech purist, I have no illusions about the harm of disinformation and extremist speech in our society. Yet I believe that speech controls pose far greater threats for our country than misguided or malevolent speech. Disinformation is a scourge in our society, but it's not a new scourge. As discussed in my testimony, the Constitution was not only written for times like these, it was written during times like these. At the start of the Republic, Republicans and Federalists were not trying to cancel each other in the contemporary sense. They were trying to kill each other in the actual sense. There was rampant conspiracy theories, and newspapers and pamphleteers were highly biased and partisan. This is also not the first time that people in power have declared that they can rid us of this meddlesome media. The question is, who will be the arbiter of truth in any public or private regime of speech regulation? The First Amendment limits the ability of the government to regulate or censor speech. Accordingly, the United States has been spared a history of a state media like China or Iran. Yet in the last few years, it has shown that there is no need for a central ministry controlling the media if there's a common narrative or bias among private companies that control communications. The reason that most of us have opposed state media controls is not simply because we disfavor state regulation of speech, but because we favor free speech. These companies can deny free speech more effectively, more efficiently than any state apparatus. We would achieve very little in our constitutional system if we allow politicians to achieve indirectly what they cannot do directly. Of course, external controls on speech seem trivial or inconsequential when the speech is not your own, and even less if it is speech that you abhor or despise. Europe has shown that speech regulation becomes an insatiable appetite. There's no evidence that European laws actually diminished hate speech. There's plenty of evidence that they diminish free speech. That impact's evident in recent polls out of Germany, where only 18% of Germans feel free to express their opinions in public, and only 17% felt free to express themselves in the internet. Now, of course, it's notable that Angela Merkel recently criticized the United States for its crackdown on free speech, particularly Twitter, and banning people as a real threat to free speech. This appetite for speech, limiting the speech of others, is evident in the United States. We've talked briefly about the recent letter to AT&T and other companies. I'd be happy to talk about that more. But to be honest, from the perspectives of free speech and the free press, the letter is not just chilling, it's positively glacial. I admit that I may be a relic in my views, but I continue to believe that the greatest protection against bad speech is better speech. Those seeking limits often speak of free speech like it's a swimming pool that must be monitored and carefully controlled for purity and safety. I view it more as a rolling ocean. It is indeed dangerous, but it's also majestic and inspiring. Its immense size allows for a natural balance. Free speech allows false ideas to be challenged in the open rather than driving dissenting viewpoints beneath the surface. However, free speech, like other constitutional values, requires a leap of faith not only in free speech, but in each other. Citizens are capable of educating and informing themselves. They do not need politicians or corporate filters to protect them from speech false or inciting. Roughly 70 years ago, Justice William Douglas warned that the restriction of free speech is the most dangerous of all subversions. It is the one un-American act that could easily defeat us all. Some of the measures being discussed this week have the potential to defeat us all. Once again, thank you for the honor of appearing with you and with my distinguished co-panelists. I'd be happy to answer questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Turley. We now recognize Ms. Ortiza for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
All right, there we just heard from Georgetown University professor Jonathan Turley giving the response to what Soledad O'Brien had to say. Here we have another witness from the committee here giving her testimony, and she's going to talk about her experience. Her father, I believe, was hospitalized with COVID. So let's listen to that.
COVID-19 on June 30th, 2020. He was 65. My father's story is tragic, yet it is not unique. Every single day since he has passed, I have spoken to people.
All right, so let's go ahead and get some more perspective on what we just heard a moment ago, both from Soledad O'Brien and also from the Jonathan Turley, the Georgetown Law School University professor. With us now, host of Spicer and Company here on Newsmax TV, Sean Spicer, also sticking around with us, Dick Morris, and you see the hearing going on in the lower right-hand corner of our screen here. Sean, Soledad O'Brien, obviously a professional. She knows how to deliver a message in front of a TV camera. What was your reaction to what she said, though?
Well, first of all, it's a bit insane. I mean, I did get pleasure in the fact that she threw CNN under the bus, which is a bit ironic considering the goal of the members of this committee. But I think the idea that we're having a committee hearing about whether or not free speech should be tolerated on broadcast channels is something that if it was occurring the other way around, if members of the Republican majority at that time were having a hearing about what's being broadcast on CNN or MSNBC, we would be hearing, discussions of censorship and right-wing craziness. And yet for today, not only are the members of Congress not crying foul on this on the left, but frankly, members of the journalist community who stand up for free speech all the time are silent. And I think that speaks volumes to the Washington Post, the New York Times, to everybody else who talks about the importance of the freedom of the First Amendment provides us, and yet stays silent when government officials, members of Congress from the Democratic Party, try to say that because we don't like what we're hearing on channels like Newsmax, we're going to silence them. But, John, I've been tweeting this out all day. I think it's ironic. Soledad O'Brien, in her testimony, lists all of the organizations that she's worked for, right? She talks about her own broadcast channel, WBZ in Boston. She talks about CNN and a couple of these other places. What she doesn't mention is Al Jazeera, an organization that has been determined to be a foreign agent. Why didn't she mention them? It's interesting. She talks about trust. She talks about the need to be transparent. Well, she wasn't there. She basically lied in her own testimony when talking about the need for trust and who you book as a guest. Well, there she is being booked as a guest at a congressional hearing, and she's not being honest about her own background. That speaks volumes to not only her, but who they chose to call as a witness.
Sometimes, Sean, this reminds me of my old days as a reporter when you go to, the Solid Waste Authority or something to cover a story at the dump, and it smells bad at first, but you just become used to the smell. It smells so bad, Dick. But to hear the type of testimony, the allegations of murder again brought up, and we know there are no real murder charges here, at least from the most recent report as related to Brian Sitnick. They say this was a deadly attack on the Capitol, but the circumstances and the details are a little bit murky at this point. So, Dick, what was your reaction to what we've heard so far, and just how far it seems willing the Democrats and even Soledad O'Brien has been willing to go to kind of shade this for their side?
Well, it's shocking, and the mere fact of this hearing, as I said earlier, is intimidating and is itself a form of censorship. But let's remember how we got here. The Democrats changed the rules in this election to permit massive use of paper ballots and absentee voting. That raised concerns about the integrity of the results. President Trump and many Republicans protested those results and said that they were not accurate. The Democratic Party then moved to criminalize that speech and to call it seditious, not just an expression of opinion. And when the Capitol Hill riot happened, they characterized that as an insurgency, an attempt to invade and overthrow the U.S. government, the first unarmed attempt at a coup d'etat in world history. And anyone who discusses the election with a negative tone toward its results and implies that there was any concern about its integrity is committing sedition. And the purpose of this hearing is to bar TV networks that say that from being on the air by getting the cable companies to delist them and take them off the programming.
And I know both of you.
I'm not commenting on whether the election returns are right or whether there was fraud or whether any of those allegations are true or not. That's not the purpose of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the very fact of discussing that has been seen to be seditious and is now being used as the basis for saying it incited violence and it weakens trust in American democracy and ought to be censored.
And Sean, you know this as well as anybody, having been in that position as a White House press secretary, a lot of these words have specific meaning and they are not, thrown around on accident. Words like insurrection and murder, those words are chosen on purpose. And it's also, very important what Dick is talking about when you have some of the same people that want to push ahead with this hearing, including Congresswoman Diana DeGette, who's one of the House impeachment managers. Again, they want to have this hearing, but they don't want to even acknowledge the hearing or the election challenge that took place. And again, some of the same people that protested the last election in 2017 and also in 2004.
You got several issues, right? The hypocrisy of the left, which is endless and boundless. And we've mentioned a couple of the examples of the things that they've done and said in the past and how their own words don't match with the rhetoric they have now. But I think the attacks on the First Amendment are something that we can't overlook right now. The fact of the matter is, you look at CNN, they had to do an unknown settlement to Nick Sandmann for making up a story about the individual. They've been engaged in other settlements with other individuals who they frankly lied about, who they've made up stories about. They've retracted several stories, not just them, but the Washington Post, the New York Times, etc. And yet you have a hearing right now trying to delist media outlets that, frankly, this is the problem. And this is what no one wants to talk about, John, up there, is that Newsmax has grown because more and more people are tuning in because it is a place where people who haven't had their voice heard, who haven't had issues and policies covered in a way that they've seen before, are flocking to a place like Newsmax, right? And what's happening is we are an existential threat to the mere existence of the success of these other cable stations. And so what do? Instead of trying to figure out how do they survive in a land of competition, they decide that what their answer is to get and to contribute to these politicians, which they've done. Look at the money. Look at the money that these individuals have taken from these cable companies. And they are doing their bidding. And what they're saying is that we're going to go ahead and cancel them out for you because we want to make sure that CNN lives in an island by itself and doesn't have the opportunity to face any serious competition.
That is the
world.
But
every time a viewer turns into Newsmax, we undermine that argument.
Hi, Emma Reckenberg here. If you like this video, there's a whole lot more to see on Newsmax TV. You can watch for free right here on our YouTube live stream and be the first one here each time our experts break down real news. Just hit that subscribe button, ring the bell icon, and stay with us on America's fastest growing cable news channel, Newsmax TV.